Hi there and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Capellos in Ottawa on this Tuesday. Tonight, Ontario pitted against the prairies.
I respect what they're doing, but there's no damn way we should drop tariffs on China, I'll tell you that.
China's ambassador exclusively tells CTV News that tariffs punishing prairie agriculture, will be lifted if the feds lift Canadian tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The comments spurred immediate reaction from premiers in Saskatchewan and Manitoba who are asking the Prime Minister to do just that. In moments, we're going to get the perspective from the industries affected. Then, new week, new Trump tariffs.
What we're saying is that the industry is at a tipping point.
Fresh U.S. tariffs slapped on Canadian lumber and wood products, with BC's premier now saying the key industry in his province is at risk. And David Eby is accusing the federal government of not prioritizing the forestry sector. Our front bench will dig into the tariff troubles. Up this evening, Dan Moulton, Tom Mulcair, Larissa Waller, and Laura Stone. That's just ahead. Plus, what comes next in the Middle East?
We did something monumental. We got the hostages back.
Can U.S. President Donald Trump's Gaza ceasefire plan hold now that Hamas has released all living Israeli hostages and Israel has released more than 1,700 Palestinian prisoners? Our Heather Wright will join us from Tel Aviv coming up a little bit later on in the show. First, though.
I had a conversation the other day. Scott called me up and said, hey, I got to protect my province. I get it. I get why Wob Canoe and Scott are saying, you know, drop the tariffs, but I have to do the same thing, and I respect their sector. They ship about $4.9 billion to China on canola. Well, look at our auto sector. It's 157,000 workers, direct jobs, indirect. Multiply that by 4 times. We've seen over $46 billion of new investments. So I respect what they're doing, but there's no damn way we should drop tariffs on China, I'll tell you that.
That's Ontario Premier Doug Ford speaking in Toronto, voicing again his desire for Canada to keep its tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles. His comments come just after our exclusive interview here at CTV News with China's ambassador to Canada over the weekend. His blunt message: China will lift its tariffs on Canadian canola products if Canada lifts its levies on EVs. Have a listen.
So if Canada removes the unilateral unjustified tariffs on Chinese products, China will also reciprocate accordingly. And if the EV tariffs are removed, then China will also remove the tariffs on the relevant products of Canada.
And not all premiers disagree with that proposition. Unlike Ford, prairie provinces are pushing for Prime Minister Mark Carney and his government to lift their tariffs on China. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, for example, posting to social media, Minister Anand is in China over the next few days. This is a clear signal of how Ottawa can act this week. It's time for Ottawa to get this deal done on behalf of 200,000 Canadian workers. And Manitoba's Premier Wob Canoe also urging federal action, writing in an open letter to the Prime Minister. That reads in part, while protecting our automotive sector is important, the current approach has created a two-front trade war that disproportionately impacts Western Canada. I encourage, Premier Canoe goes on to say, your government to pursue a negotiated resolution, eliminate the EV tariff in exchange for restoring full access for Canadian agricultural products to the Chinese market. We have also reached out to the Prime Minister's office as well as Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand on the ambassador's comments. A spokesperson at Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne's office did provide us with this response since the EV tariffs fall under the Finance Department. It says in part, the Prime Minister has recently signaled his intent to meet with China's president at the appropriate time to explore ways to stabilize and deepen our trade relationship. Canada will always stand up for its workers and industries and will continue to act with determination and foresight to safeguard our long-term economic resilience. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, meanwhile, has previously supported the tariffs and was asked directly if Canada should reverse course on the policy.
I think what's happening is that the Chinese government sees in Mark Carney a very weak prime minister, and as a result, they're taking advantage of that.
Do you agree that Canada should drop its tariffs on Chinese EVs if China will drop tariffs on
Well, I take a different view. I think that what we should do is tell the Chinese government that we're going to remove the billion-dollar loan for for China to build BC ferries, because we should not be giving $1 billion of taxpayers' money to a country that's targeting our farmers and fishermen.
So let's talk to the industries impacted by both sets of tariffs. First, the auto sector. Flavio Volpe is the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, and Brian Kingston is the president and chief executive officer of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Hi, both of you. Thanks very much for making the time for the conversation. Brian, I will start with you. The Chinese ambassador used the word unjustified to characterize the initial set of tariffs on electric vehicles, which were applied about a year ago by the then federal government under Prime Minister Trudeau. In your view, I know you take a different view. Why, in your view, are they justified?
They are extremely justified because the Chinese economic model follows a very simple formula: scale, dump, and destroy. They've scaled their industry through massive subsidies. $230 billion have gone into the EV industry. Then they dump the excess product abroad. China is going to be exporting, by the end of this decade, almost 10 million vehicles abroad. And then they destroy the industries in those markets by using predatory pricing and undermining the industrial sectors in those target export destinations. We cannot allow that to happen, and that's why the federal government took the actions that it did. They put in place a tariff to protect our market. It is the right move, and regardless of what the ambassador is saying, we cannot change that stance.
How has it, if at all, Flavio, protected the domestic market here? Because I think Canadians will be well aware of a lot that has changed in the interim, right? In that last year politically, particularly south of the border, and the policies pursued there around electric vehicles. Like, has this had the desired impact on the industry?
Well, the thing that we had asked for was to say, look, if manufacturers and the supply chain and the raw materials suppliers in the critical minerals and then also in steel and aluminum are going to have a chance in electrifying, and we've been pushing very hard for electrification because I think it plays to Canadian strengths, then we need to put these tariffs in place to buy some time with the Chinese. When Brian says they will be exporting 10 million vehicles a year, your viewers should know that's 10% of the world's market being exported from China at a subsidized rate. That's about as many vehicles are manufactured in the U.S., which a lot of you viewers might think is the world's biggest auto manufacturing play, but they make 11 million cars a year in that market. This scale, dump, and destroy is what they did in consumer electronics and what they did in solar. And you know, I know that this is a tense moment when we have a trade fight with the two world's biggest economic superpowers, but giving up the market for no reason it doesn't work out for anybody, whether that's people who work in automotive or people who work in lumber or people who work in farming. And then again, and I'll just say this, I don't know why we're taking the cues from the Chinese ambassador. He was sent from Beijing. And it's very disappointing to hear premiers work off the cue from your interview to tell the rest of Canadians what we should be doing out loud. We can have disputes on what the Canadian position is, but do it in the locker room and then go out and play the game. Don't say, hey, by the way, we're going to lose to the Yankees and we should just give up.
Which we didn't, by the way. We're now worried about Seattle, but that's a whole different story for a different type of show. Brian, I wondered if you could, in layman's terms, when both you and Flavio refer to the practices that China engages in, I'm not sure, I even fully understand like what it is that is so unfair. Because when we talk about subsidization, for example, there's a lot of that happening here. There's a lot of government money that, for example, was promised for the EV sector, for the auto sector, for a lot of protectionist stuff that we're doing, to be fair, against the backdrop of other countries doing protectionist stuff. But like, what is so wrong about the practice China engages in, and why is it so hard to counter?
Well, China is the big leagues of subsidization, sticking to the baseball analogy. The amount of money that they put into the sectors that they strategically target is far beyond anything that we would see in North America. Yes, governments have tried to support the auto industry here in Canada, in Ontario, but the amounts of money that are spent are nowhere close to what China does. Secondly, China benefits from weak labor practices and weak environmental practices. And so I find it perplexing when you've got groups, environmental groups in Canada saying we should have Chinese EVs in this country. I'll give you an example. A typical Chinese manufacturing facility is paying a production worker between $2 and $5 an hour. At a facility in Canada, a unionized facility, you're talking $44 an hour plus pension and benefits. On top of that, 60% of Chinese electricity is still coal-fired. We have 80% renewable electricity in this country. So what are we doing even contemplating this that makes absolutely no sense to offshore jobs and carbon emissions to China just so that people can have a slightly cheaper car.
They are, Flavio, though, contemplating this, right? The federal government, even in advance of this interview, said this is something that is up for review, which is a change in posture from the previous government under Prime Minister Trudeau, who insisted that they would stick with the plan that they had laid out last fall. Game out for us, if you could, the impact you think removing these tariffs would have on the sector, particularly at this time where it's at an incredibly vulnerable point.
Well, look, right now the biggest challenge is for the sector with Washington. We've got the White House saying they don't want Canadian cars. And there's about $80 billion worth of exports from Canada into the U.S. Every year that, like Premier Ford was talking about, employs 150,000 people directly and probably over 500,000 people indirectly. How this is going to play in Washington, where we talk about Fortress North America, and how it's going to play in Mexico City, who just levied a 50% tariff on all Chinese vehicles, whether they run on gas or electricity, is that Canada is opening the door for the Chinese who are not invested here, who have no American, Mexican, or Canadian content in any of their cars, and letting them in, kind of like when zebra mussels came into the Great Lakes in the 80s and crowded out everything else. And when Brian talks about subsidies, let me make it real plain for our viewers here. Yes, everybody heard about tens of billions of dollars potential in Canada. The Chinese in automotive, in EVs, is 230 billion US that we know. That's 350 plus Canadian, plus the subsidies in steel and aluminum and in plastics. That's over $1 trillion in subsidies, so that they could sell vehicles at a price that you really want them. Please take it from us. And in Mexico, that strategy worked, that in 1 year, in 2023, they went from 5% market to 20% market. Those are less sales for Canadian companies in the Mexican market, less sale for American-based manufacturing at the time that we're trying to negotiate staying in the CUSMA and the USMCA.
Okay, I got to leave it on that note. Both of you, thank you very much for making the time. I appreciate it, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Always a great conversation. Brian Kingston and Flavio Volpe. We also did invite Saskatchewan's Premier Scott Moe and Manitoba's Premier Wab Kinew on our program tonight to expand on the letters that they wrote Prime Minister Carney, but both were unavailable. Joining us now with the agricultural side, however, of this trade dispute is Rick White, the CEO of the Canadian Canola Growers Association. Hi, Rick. It's good to have you on the show. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thanks, Vashi. Good to see you.
Before we get into the prospect of these tariffs being removed, I just wondered if you could explain to our viewers the impact that the Chinese tariffs on canola has had on the sector.
Well, it's had a very significant impact on the canola sector because China is our second largest export market. And, it's about $5 billion, $5.2 billion in 2024 was the export value of canola seed, oil, and meal into the country, and it went in at no tariff. So when you look at it from a farmer's perspective, we see the prices are now depressed, and it's significant. We're looking at about a $1.5 billion hit to the farmer sector right now, just on canola because of China. This industry and this sector of the canola industry contributes about $43.7 billion in both direct and indirect benefits to the Canadian economy. And a lot of that is to the rural economy. And it generates 200,000 jobs. So we're not a small sector. It's not a small crop. It's a significant crop. And this is a very serious problem for the industry, with having our second largest export market shut down because we cannot send seed oil or meal given these tariff levels.
Were you surprised at how explicit the ambassador was? I know behind the scenes, this was sort of understood that it was a sort of quid pro quo, that those tariffs, even though China had used other justification, were in response to the EV tariffs. Were you surprised at all at how explicit the ambassador was in this instance?
But I don't think surprise is the right word. It was good to hear and acknowledge it very vocally, like he did, very clearly. We knew all along that is what triggered the problems that we have in canola with China and all the tariffs that went on, reciprocating from that. So it's good to hear it from the ambassador and our own Canadian government has heard that as well. And we really, really hope that this is the start of a negotiation, because these tariffs need to be eliminated for canola. And the sooner the better, because every day, every week, every month that goes by, it's a big price to pay for our agriculture industry.
Have you received any assurances from the federal government, any cabinet ministers, the prime minister? Because I know that they've announced some supports for the canola industry, for example, and held some meetings. Any assurances that that could be in the cards, that the full lift of those tariffs could be in the cards?
Well, I think what we heard from the Prime Minister himself and several senior federal ministers as well is they understand fully what's at stake here. They are and have been supportive, and the Prime Minister had announced some support measures for the industry. So that was a start. But we have been heard, and we have been in communication, and we have been assured that this will get fixed, but the question is, how long is it going to take to get this cleared up?
I wanted to ask, kind of a bigger picture moving forward, if there is the ability to diversify away from China, or if it's a goal of the industry to diversify away from China as such a large market. And I ask because we've been here before, right? It's clear that when China feels that they have been unfairly targeted, they go after the sector where they can have the most impact. And canola has been vulnerable to that, and I believe it was in 2018, and even once before that. And now here we are again. Is there an objective to move away from such a reliance on China as a trade partner in this respect?
It's definitely an objective. The problem is that the Chinese market is so large. When we look around the world for other destinations for canola, they are very small, and they're spread around the globe, and they wouldn't even come close to replacing China. But what we do need to do is reduce our reliance on China. And so what we've been encouraging the federal government to do is to help in getting a biofuel, a renewable diesel, domestic biofuel and biodiesel here in Canada, which will utilize canola seed in the production of cleaner and greener renewable diesel. And that could take up 2.5 million tons of canola seed if we get the environment right for that to happen. And so far it hasn't. We've talked to the government. They are making steps towards making that happen and making it more of a reality. But it's a much better diversification strategy to have a made in Canada solution to utilizing more seed that we control, that doesn't have to cross international borders, and we don't have to rely on foreign governments and foreign regulations that can and do block us. And what China's has come to be is fairly regular, on again, off again. When they're on, it's big, it's good, but when they're off, holy smoke, it really brings the industry down, and it's hard on the industry, hard on farmers, hard on the investment longer term. So we need to move ourselves away, at least in a way that we can avoid putting so much reliance on the China market.
Okay, Rick, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for sharing your time tonight. I appreciate it and your insights.
Thank you, Vashti.
Thank you. That's Rick White. Meanwhile, Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand is in India before she heads to China, meeting with the Prime Minister there, Narendra Modi, seeking to normalize trade relations between our two countries. The first official visit by a cabinet minister since relations soured 2 years ago after the Canadian government and RCMP accused India of involvement in homicides, extortion and violence in Canada. The minister says India has agreed to let a full complement of Canadian diplomatic staff back into that country.
This is a step-by-step approach. It is a systematic approach that the Government of Canada is taking, and I am here to emphasize the importance of the comprehensive nature of the joint declaration and the work that we will do together in building the bilateral relationship step by step.
All right, I've got to take a quick break here on Power Play. On the other end of that break, BC is calling out Western alienation as Donald Trump slaps fresh tariffs on Canadian lumber. We're going to talk about that with our front bench. Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Tom Mulcair, and Laura Stone are here in just 2 minutes. Stick around. We're back in a moment.
if he can't get a deal, we have to hit back. Yeah. We just have to. And I'm not speaking on behalf of any premier, but my good friend Scott Moe, he has the uranium, he has the potash. The uranium keeps their 94 nuclear facilities going down in the U.S.
Because Ottawa is in Ontario, because it's beside Quebec, those provinces are often front of mind. And so my anxiety as a British Columbian, as a Western premier, is that we have to be way more aggressive to make sure that we get our message heard.
Provincial anxiety on high as Donald Trump slaps tariffs on a suite of softwood products, with some now up to 45%. BC's David Eby isn't holding back, accusing the feds of caring more about industries in central Canada than the lumber industry in his province. As the Prime Minister seeks a trade deal with Trump, how should the feds respond? Let's bring in our front bench. Former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, Dan Moulton, is here. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Next to him, Larissa Waller is the founder of Henley Strategies. She's a former head of communications for Ontario's Conservative Premier, Doug Ford, as well. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, and Laura Stone rounds us out. She's a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Very nice to see you. Hope you had a nice Thanksgiving weekend. Tom, I'll start with you. And I thought it's for different reasons, and actually they're kind of, David Eby is saying, hey, you're prioritizing Central Canada, but Doug Ford is saying, especially where autos are concerned, hey, we still need to hit back harder. I'm going to launch this ad campaign, for example, to the tune of $75 million. If there are some emerging cracks in the Team Canada that we've heard so much about for the last 6 months, and how difficult that might end up being for the Prime Minister, as he, freely concedes now he's working on these really sectoral deals.
Right, and it really is discouraging to hear David Eby go down that path because today's new tariffs are hitting not only the softwood lumber sector very hard, but they're hitting the furniture manufacturing sector hard. And he just dismissed Quebec as being too close to Ottawa. This just in, the biggest province in terms of furniture manufacturing is Quebec. So they are extremely worried, and they have to be in lockstep with all provinces, including British Columbia. And last week, when Mr. Carney was in Washington, we heard that they talked about steel, aluminum, and out of the blue, the Keystone XL pipeline, energy. But nobody talked about automobiles, apparently, or lumber. So yeah, it's an important thing, and we've got a pitch to be making to the Americans that it's not the Canadian government that pays these tariffs, and it's not even Canadian companies that pay them. It's American consumers. If you're building a house in the States and you've got a 45% tariff on the lumber going in to build that house, most of the lumber used in the US comes from Canada, guess what? The price of that house just went up tens of thousands of dollars, if not $100,000. So it's going to take a while for that to get through to American consumers, but it's going to start showing up in the inflation figures. And finally, Donald Trump, who's played this magnificently, is going to be found out by the average American voter.
In the meantime, Dan, there's this interesting tension point where I think the premiers want to be able to show the sectors they largely represent that they are being aggressive in defending them. And you've got Prime Minister Carney essentially, not hitting back at this moment in time in order to try and secure a trade deal, at least as he explains it or his government explains it, trade deals, even on a sector-by-sector basis with the administration. Like if he hits back in the way Ford wants him to right now, what I seem to interpret from his comments thus far is that would jeopardize any progress that could be made. But that is inherently at odds with what Premier Eby and Ford are hoping for right now.
That's right. I think the provincial premiers, more than anything, are trying to speak to a domestic political audience that wants to see them strong on these issues, wants to see them fighting back. They want to see elbows up. Like that is where voters are and what voters have been rewarding, not just here in Canada, but around the world. They like aggressive tactics to fight back against the aggressive tactics that President Trump has been using. The reality, though, is that while the provinces can do that quite easily because they don't have a trade deal to negotiate, the Prime Minister is in a more difficult position, trying to balance the domestic political needs of the voters who want to see action from Canada, want to see us standing up for ourselves, but also he needs to secure a deal. And I think we saw a lot of that at play last week in the Oval Office. It's a tightrope for him to walk, and it's not going to be easy. But if on the other side of it, if he can cross that rope and secure a deal, I think he'll be in a very strong political position. Until then, it's going to be challenging.
And I think if I, again, interpret what I've listened to so far, especially from the Prime Minister and his delegates, Larissa, like what would come first would be on steel and aluminum. There might perhaps need to be more communication about at least wanting to secure a deal on the other fronts, on forestry, on cars, like or maybe more honesty about the prospect of that, so that those sectors, those premiers feel more in the loop. I guess maybe that. I'm not sure your thoughts.
I highly doubt that there's a premier that's not in the loop. And I think, many of us are communicators by trade. And when we communicate, we think about who our audience is and we think about timing. And I think that the premiers very likely have given the Prime Minister some grace to prioritize what he needs to prioritize, just as I imagine the Prime Minister is giving the premiers some grace to speak to the constituencies they need to speak to. So Doug Ford with his ad campaign, and frankly, it's a brilliant ad campaign that speaks to the heart of the Republican parties, that talks about the damage that tariffs do to American families and to the American economy. And it's a story that needs to be told directly to Americans. And I commend the Ontario government for doing this ad. I encourage everybody to watch it. You won't see it in Canada probably unless you get U.S. channels, because they're spending about 75. Oh, we have it. Let's watch it. It's so good. But
okay,
I think Sorry. Go ahead.
I'm going to throw to a little bit of it so our audience knows what we're talking about, and then I'll get you right back. Can we play that now, guys?
High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs. Throughout the world, there's a growing realization that the way to prosperity for all nations is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition. America's jobs and growth are at stake.
So if you recognize the voice, that's Ronald Reagan narrating the majority of that. Sorry, Larissa, go ahead, and then I'll get Laura in.
No, I was going to say for the 40 and under crowd, that's Ronald Reagan, who was a very popular Republican president, who was like the father of free trade, especially with Canada, and letting Americans and Republicans and party loyalist Republicans hear Ronald Reagan remind them of why free trade, especially with Canada, is important, I think is a wise use of money by the Ontario government.
Well, Bavashi, if I could, I would just say I think it was very nice of you to play the ad for the Ontario government here today, because I think the domestic political audience here in Ontario is as much the intended audience as any American that will ever see it.
Yeah, I would just, first of all, just so that you know, it's in a box that clearly identifies it as an ad. I'm not running it as an ad. The U.S. networks are getting all that money, not the Canadian ones, to be clear. Laura, you were at the speech today that the Premier gave, where he was talking about this and launching this stuff. And, what is your feeling on, he still had a lot of praise for the Prime Minister. What is your feeling on how much daylight there is there between them?
Well, look, on the ad, I think two things can be true at the same time. I think it is, as Larissa said, a legitimately very good advertisement. I also think it probably won't make a difference to Donald Trump's decision-making process, if we can call it that. Ontario has already spent tens of millions on an ad campaign detailing the closeness of the relationship between the United States and the province and working together. I'm not sure it really had much of an impact. That's not to say that the province and other provinces shouldn't try, because I think the guests are absolutely right that many of these premiers are speaking to the citizens of their own provinces. This is almost an episode of protectionist premiers. They have to protect their own industries, and Premier Ford said as much. Look, we were wondering whether the bromance between Mark Carney and Doug Ford was a little bit on shaky ground. Today, it seemed to be alive and well. Lots of praise for Mr. Carney as an astute business person, talking about how well he did in the Oval Office the other week. But Doug Ford has his view on this, which is that Ontario should hit back. They should retaliate. That is not the way that the federal government is going. They're running in the opposite direction. And, Mr. Carney is almost, showing kind of glowing praise for the president at times. So he's doing what he has to do. So are the premiers. But they're set to meet, Prime Minister Carney and Premier Ford are set to meet in Toronto on Thursday, if that meeting does indeed go ahead. So they'll be spending a little more time together over coffee or chats. But look, I think they are playing to their own audiences at this time. And I think we're in a bit of a communications vacuum with the federal government. We don't hear as much publicly about how those talks are going on a daily basis, that is, but things are obviously happening behind the scenes, and you can understand sort of the impatience from some of the provinces over how difficult the economic impacts have been for their own workers.
Yeah, good point. I've got to take a quick commercial break. Our front bench is sticking around. We're going to dive back into our top story, those comments from China's ambassador here to CTV News that are pitting some premiers against each other. Back in a moment with that.
So if Canada removes the unilateral unjustified tariffs on Chinese products, China will also reciprocate accordingly. And if the EV tariffs are removed, then China will also remove the tariffs on the relevant products of Canada.
Those exclusive comments to CTV News over the weekend from China's ambassador to Canada are sparking lots of political reaction just days ahead of Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand's visit to China later this week. While some premiers, like Scott Moe and Wab Kinew, want to see Canada's EV tariffs on China lifted to provide relief to the canola sector. Those are some letters you're looking at that they wrote the Prime Minister directly. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford does not want the levies to go anywhere. Take a listen.
I had a conversation the other day. Scott called me up and said, hey, I got to protect my product. I get it. I get why Wab Kinew and Scott are saying, you know, drop the tariffs. But I have to do the same thing, and I respect their sector. They ship about $4.9 billion to China on canola. Well, look at our auto sector. It's 157,000 workers, direct jobs, indirect. Multiply that by 4 times. We've seen over $46 billion of new investments. So I respect what they're doing, but there's no damn way we should drop tariffs on China, I'll tell you that.
So how does the Prime Minister navigate this one? Our front bench is back. Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Tom Mulcair, and Laura Stone. Larissa, I'll start with you on this one. And I should point out to our audience, this is a very heavily weighted to Ontario panel. So keep that in mind. I worked in Saskatchewan, Alberta, so I'll try to voice that perspective. And Tom, of course, is joining us from Quebec. This is going to be an interesting one. My anticipation is that the Prime Minister will meet President Xi on the sidelines of APAC as soon as that, so just a few weeks from now. Do you think ultimately, like when he's weighing this out, there have to be political considerations, particularly on the domestic front?
Sure, and I also think they wouldn't allow they being the Prime Minister's staff and the Chinese political staff wouldn't allow for a meeting unless there was some pre-negotiated outcome that they can point to show that the meeting was fruitful. But at the end of the day, the Prime Minister has to weigh a lot of other things beyond how important canola is to the Canadian economy, and it is our number one export that we grow. But it is not our number one export, and he's a dollar and cents guy. The Prime Minister has to weigh what's our number one export, who is our number one trading partner. That is still the United States. It doesn't matter that we're in a bit of a tense relationship there, and I appreciate also that the Prime Minister is playing the relationship game with Donald Trump. So both on our own domestic kind of economic factoring side, but also in the world where we don't want to tick off the U.S. president who has his own contentious relationship with China, we can't afford to drop those tariffs. But I do think that the Prime Minister and fellow premiers are going to give, again, each other a little bit of grace to advocate for their constituencies and advocate for what they really need. But at the end of the day, the auto sector is too important, and so is our relationship with the United States.
Do you ever expect the Prime Minister, Dan, to be that frank if that's ultimately the decision he makes?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's political considerations, first and foremost, need to be to satisfy a voter demand for some more calm and less friction in our trading relationship with the United States. I think that's where voters need to see progress, and I think that's where the Prime Minister is going to look to deliver it first. I agree with Larissa. I doubt that the Prime Minister would be having that high stakes of a meeting without some sense of what's going to come out on the other side of it. But I think the key factor that the Prime Minister's office is considering is if there were any movements in our trade relationship with China, how will it impact ongoing negotiations with the White House and our trading relationship with the United States. And if decisions we make on the Chinese front are going to create more turbulence or more friction on our trading relationship with the United States, I highly doubt that they'll be taken.
Herein, though, Tom, we have another point of friction, right? Because on the one hand, we want to expand our trading relationship with other countries because of what's going on with the United States. And China, given its market size, is really the only country that can come close to supplanting the U.S. Not that it necessarily will, but that, offers that opportunity. At the same time, the U.S. under Donald Trump, just like under Joe Biden, treats China as an adversary for many of the reasons that the auto sector representatives on our program earlier laid out, right? Unfair trading practices, national security concerns. So doing something that's offside with the U.S. when it comes to China could also present complications. So how do you square that circle if you're the prime minister?
I agree with you. It could also produce complications, but it also might open the eyes of the Americans to the simple fact that they can't always have it their own way. Prior to Donald Trump's re-election, Canada chose to put itself in lockstep with the Americans in imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Now, there's been a lot of retroactive explanation that there was this much government investment and there was a reason for it. There wasn't a heck of a lot of reason for it other than the fact that that's what the Americans were doing, and they asked us to do the same. At some point, we've got to ask ourselves whether we keep doing the bidding of a country that has said in so many words, and it was Howard Lutnick who said it last week, that they want to clobber the Canadian auto industry. So does that industry keep holding out its withered hand to the vivisectionist, or do Canadians look at this situation and say it's got to mean something when Prime Minister Carney says he wants to establish new trade routes, new trading partners? So I think that we do have to have a very serious look as to whether or not it got us anything other than a smack in the head from the Americans when we did their bidding and we imposed these 100% tariffs, and whether it makes any sense to keep them there, because what we got is not only the smack from the Americans, but massive tariffs from the Chinese as retaliation against one of our key agricultural sectors. I think that Carney, of course, and Dominic LeBlanc, they're dealing with a whole bunch of things at the same time. And I guess a certain amount of abnegation is required. But I think at some point, Canada has to realize that we can't keep being the sucker in this game. And I think that Trump and Lutnick are playing Canada for suckers right now. They think that they could just keep imposing tariffs, and we'll keep helping them by keeping out Chinese electric vehicles at the expense, quite literally, of the Canadian automobile consumer. I think that those things have to be on the table with eyes wide open. If we're talking about new trading partners and new trading routes to deal with the fact that the Americans are going down this path, then we should give some serious consideration to simply lifting those tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. I think that a lot of Canadians would be really happy if we were to do that. I know that consumers in Great Britain loved it. And as I heard the representative of the Canadian auto manufacturers before, the same thing happened in Mexico. And I think that we're not giving ourselves a fair shake when we keep saying, oh, well, keep trying to get something out of the Americans, because all that's gotten us so far is grief.
Although those same representatives in the auto sector, the Premier of Ontario, Laura, who you covered today, is very interested in defending, those would be the group of people, and Tom's right to point out that there's a lot of Canadians who don't see the intended impact of these tariffs, but that sector continues to argue for their effectiveness, particularly at a time. I think it's fair to say, like a year and a half ago, both the Ontario and federal governments were saying this was the future industrial policy for our country. Electric vehicles and associated parts, we're going to subsidize those industries ourselves, we're going to build them up. Clearly, the competitive environment with the U.S. has changed things. The policies in the U.S. have changed things, and they're at an even more vulnerable point now than they were before. How do you think that ultimately impacts? I know where Premier Ford stands, but how do you think that ultimately impacts what the Prime Minister does?
Well, I mean, it's quite a conundrum, to be quite honest, right? I mean, he's got to balance all these different priorities. And as Tom rightly pointed out, we do have to diversify our trade. We're getting punched in the gut by our closest ally on a daily basis. And I think, this whole episode does raise questions for the Canadian public of why Canada is aligning itself with the United States on its auto policy when, officials are openly saying they don't want us to succeed. They essentially don't want Canada to have an auto industry. The stakes are also extremely high for Premier Doug Ford, who has made a big gamble on the EV industry, as you said, Vashi, as the future of the auto industry in Ontario, and has poured tens of millions of dollars, and along with the federal government, billions into this industry. And so, all of these factors do have to be balanced by the prime minister. But I think, the key here to me, I think, is the C word, compromise. I think you could see, Anita Anand, foreign minister, traveling to China, this talk of the prime minister meeting with the top Chinese officials. I mean, this all signals, I think, to Canadians that we are going to have to find a compromise with these countries where we've had frosty relations, India, China, and others, in the face of this new relationship with the United States, and come to some sort of compromise that works for everyone. And maybe everyone has to put a bit of water in their wine here, because we're not going to satisfy everyone, but maybe people can, premiers and provinces are going to have to find a balance that they can live with here, that doesn't, punish certain sectors or certain provinces fully in the way that we're seeing right now.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Thanks, everyone. Great discussion. Appreciate your time on this Tuesday. Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Tom Mulcair, and Laura Stone, our wonderful front bench panel. We'll take a quick break here on Power Play. On the other end of that break, we'll get an update from Tel Aviv on the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. Back in a moment.
We did something monumental. We got the hostages back. That was the first thing we had to do. Above all else, get the hostages back. Now, they misrepresented, because we were told they had 26, 24 of dead hostages, if we can use those terms. And it seems as though they don't have that, because we're talking about a much lesser number. But that's a very tough subject. I want them back.
Welcome back to Power Play. U.S. President Donald Trump there at the White House this afternoon, shortly after he returned from a signing ceremony in Egypt for a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, brokered by his administration. The U.S. president also posting to social media, all 20 hostages are back and feeling as good as can be expected. A big burden has been lifted, but the job is not done. The dead, as you heard him say in that clip, have not been returned as promised. Phase 2, he wrote, begins right now. And CTV's Heather Wright joins us from Tel Aviv. Hey, Heather. I just wanted to start off with where you are right now and sort of what you've been able to take in on the reaction there.
Well, certainly a very emotional 24, 36 hours, Vashi, here in Israel, as those 20 living hostages were finally brought back home after more than 2 years in captivity. We've been speaking with people here on the ground over the last several days, talking about how many had been stuck on October 7th, 2023, unable to really move forward with their lives, with so many people still stuck in captivity. So now with them home, there has been this sense of relief, but also a lot of pain and anger for the families of those who are deceased but still held in Gaza. We know that only 4 were returned to Israel yesterday, causing a lot of anger. We do know that the Israeli military has confirmed they are expecting to receive more bodies tonight and tomorrow from Hamas. But this has really, sown a lot of mistrust in this process, people calling for Israel to respond. And at this point, we do know that Israel is going to start limiting aid going into Gaza in response to this, sort of as a pressure tactic to get Hamas to release as many of those bodies as quickly as they can.
What you're describing is, of course, Heather, the more immediate part of this peace agreement. There is still a lot more that is supposed to come. Where do things stand as far as that goes? I know there's a ton of uncertainty, and where will you be watching in the coming weeks?
Well, a lot of uncertainty, Vashi, and a lot of ambiguity. We're now in phase 2 of this ceasefire. Phase 1 ended with the hostages released and with the prisoners and detainees released back into the West Bank and into Gaza. So now we're in phase 2, but nobody really knows yet what comes next. There is that 20-point plan that President Trump outlined, but how to get to some of those more contentious details is unknown. Those would be Hamas disarming, Israel withdrawing completely from the occupied, from Gaza rather. And so these are some of the questions that have yet to be determined in terms of what's going to happen next. We do know that mediators are beginning to meet to go over some of these details, but it is going to be likely a lengthy process because, of course, we know that this is all contentious. And in the backdrop of all of this happening, of course, is a humanitarian crisis that continues to unfold in Gaza. We've talked to a number of people in the enclave over the last, several days, but really weeks and months, saying even though the bombardment has stopped and so that immediate threat is gone, they are still faced with food insecurity, not knowing where their next meal is going to come from. I texted with one man yesterday who was saying, I'm looking for a home. Life is a disaster. So there is still so much uncertainty in terms of even just the next day, week, months for the people living there. And then, of course, the broader questions of what comes next for the enclave, how do they rebuild the enclave, and then those questions more broadly of the future of a Palestinian state and what happens with self-determination for the Palestinian people.
Okay, thanks so much, Heather. Appreciate it. That's CTV's Heather Wright reporting from Tel Aviv. We'll take a short commercial break. On the other end of that break, we'll head to Newfoundland and Labrador. The election is happening in that province as we speak. We'll give you a rundown of what to expect next. Welcome back. As we speak, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador is voting in the provincial election there. I want to tell you a little bit about the people who are running. The incumbent is Liberal leader John Hogan, who of course replaced Andrew Furey when he resigned as both premier effectively and also leader of the Liberals. Tony Wakeham is the leader of the Progressive Conservatives, and Jim Dinn is leading the New Democratic Party. Now, keep in mind that the Liberals in Newfoundland and Labrador have been in power for a full decade, since 2015. As a result, the central message from the PCs is one of change. They are pitching it's time for change, while Hogan and the Liberals are pitching a stable hand. The last election in 2021 saw about 51% turnout, and at dissolution, the Liberals held 19 of 40 seats, so their relative strength in numbers has diminished over the decade, and the PCs held 14. So it will likely be an interesting race. And we have got full coverage tonight on both CTV News Channel and ctvnews.ca. That coverage gets underway at 8 o'clock local time, 6:30 Eastern. Hope you can join us then. I'm Vashi Kapelos, and this is Power Play. Thanks for watching tonight.